In this episode, we are going to create the migration for our users table. And now what migration is like a set of instructions which when you run will automatically generate the table, the database table for you. So let's start by opening up directory. Then we are going to create a new directory here called migration. Within this directory, I'm going to create a new file, PHP class called table contract. And rather than having this as a class, it's going to be an interface. And the namespace for this one is going to be up and then migration. So if you don't have these options, this dialog, obviously make sure that the namespace is up /migration, then interface table contract. Okay, and this file will have two methods that will be required on any classes that actually implement this contract. So public function up, and let's add the doc block. It's going to return void, so there's nothing to be returned from this method. Run migration, and then the other method will be also public function down, obviously public because in interfaces you can only declare public contract methods, and down will also return void, and it's going to be roll back migration. Okay, we can save and close this interface because that's all we have within this specific file. Then we're going to create another file. This time it's going to be a PHP class called migration. The namespace stays the same, so it's up migration because obviously it's within the same directory. And this one will have a public function up, which will from within which we will be able to add as many migrations as we want. We will only have one migration for user. If you have pages, you could add it here as well, and so on. So up, and then the other public function was going to be down. Pretty much what we have within this contract, but it's not basically the class that will implement this contract, even though the methods obviously match. We could call these methods whatever we want. This contract is for any migrations that we actually will be calling from within this migration class. So before we add anything, I'm going to straight away add the doc blocks here. It's going to be run migrations because it may be multiple ones, then return void as well. There's nothing to be returned from within this method, and then roll back migrations, return void as well. And before we actually add anything to these methods, let's create a new directory within the migration directory called tables. And on this one, within this directory, we're going to create a new class called user, and it's going to be under up migration and then tables. So that's the namespace, and this class will implement our contract, table contract. Let's add the method steps automatically. So there we go, we've got up and down methods that we need to implement, and using illuminate database package, which we've installed earlier, let's use the database capsule manager to start with. So manager, database capsule manager, and that's got automatically imported here, just in case you don't have automatic imports enabled within your IDE. Make sure that you use illuminate database capsule manager, and we're gonna go for schema method on this class, and then create. We want to create table users, so name of the table goes first, and then function, which takes a blueprint, which is this illuminate database schema. So blueprint, and we're going to name it table. So that's our second argument, and again that's got imported here, illuminate database schema blueprint. So now on this table we can set table. We want increments first, which is basically auto incremental ID of the record, which will, the column name will be ID. So that's the first table column, then table. Next one is going to be tiny integer. and I want this column name to be active, whether the record is active or not, and by default we'll set it to 0, so it's going to be inactive. Then we have table string type of the column data type, and it's going to be name of the user. Then table, sorry, not this table, another string which is going to be email, and it needs to be unique, so unique method as well on it. Then table, another string called password, which is the column where we're going to be storing the password for the given record. Now we could pass the second argument for all these string methods here, indicating how many characters we want this varchar, because it's going to be of a varchar type, this field, how many characters we want to specify, but I'm just going to leave it as default as 255. Then table, next one is also going to be a string which will contain a token. Whenever we reset the password, this is where our token is going to be stored, and by default it's going to be nullable, meaning that obviously when we create a new user record, the value isn't required, so this field can be empty. Okay, then we have table string again. This time is going to be remember token. When we have this checkbox with the logins, with the login form, obviously if we want the user to be remembered on this computer, then obviously this is where our token for this remember me is going to be stored. And again, we're going to keep it as 255 characters, so no second argument, and also nullable because it might be empty. And then the last thing we want to add is table time stamps. So what this timestamp does, basically this one will add the timestamps. It's timestamps. Sorry, like this. It's going to add created at and updated at. So whenever the record is created, the timestamp is going to be put into this created at field, and then updated at. Every time we're going to update the record, this value is going to be updated as well. So we can keep track, obviously, of when the record has been created and then when it was last updated. Okay, and that's pretty much our schema. It is called for our migration of the users table. Now for the down method, we need to provide the means of destroying all this that we actually creating with the up method. So in this case, we're going to again use this manager, database capsule manager, and schema method, and then on that we are going to call drop if exists table users. So that's what we want to do. If table users have been manually, for instance, removed or no longer exist for any other reason, then it's just not going to throw any errors any exceptions when we actually calling this, because it will only drop it if it exists. So our migration file is ready. Let's now open our client for the database we're going to be using. I'm using MySQL here with the Homestead. I've created a database login. There are no tables at the moment. It's just a database. If you're using PHPMyAdmin, make sure to obviously create the database as well. Or if you are using Terminal to create a database, make sure that you've got a database to work with. And then update your .env file to make sure that obviously these DB starting variables obviously reflect your local environment. So database name in my case is login, then I'm using username Homestead, and password, default password on Homestead is secret. Okay, so everything is set up. Now we could run this migration in many different ways, but before we actually do anything, let's make sure that this migration file now is making the call to this up method on this user instance. So what we're going to do from within this migration, I'm going to just do it in line rather than associating the new instance of the user with the variable. I'm just going to wrap it with the brackets. So new user, and here I want to call up method. So when we're calling up on the migration, that's going to automatically call this up method on the user. And if we have any other tables that we want to do, obviously you could create as many migration, call them all from within just the migration up. And for the down, we're going to do the same, just new user and then just down method. So in that case, we can run all of the migrations by just running a single method on a single instance of the class. Okay, so our migration file is also completed. We can close it. We can close this user migration as well and close the migration directory altogether. We could call it directly from within the index.php, but I think I'm going to create a new controller for this specific purpose, and I'm going to call it migrate controller. That's what I'm going to call this file. Okay, so obviously, in order to run it, if I want to run it within the browser, all I have to do is after the domain name, just put migrate, and this is where this migrate controller is going to be called. Without any additional segments, it's going to call the index method, which we don't have yet, so let's create it. Public function index, and from within this method, I'm going to simply, again, inline it, new migration this time. And on this migration instance, I want to call method up, which will run all of the migrations. So if we have any more, obviously, you can add another one, let's say for pages, follow the same, obviously, structure as we have for this user migration, then add it to the migration up. Just add another line, for instance, here, and add page. Obviously migration up, and then make sure that you add one for the down method as well. We obviously don't have this the page migration, so we only deal with the user one. And then obviously by calling this migration up, we're gonna run all of these migrations in one go. Okay, so again, I've used this migration here. Make sure that you import it up migration. So what we can do now, I'm just going to add the doc block. It returns return void and run migrations. So if we now go back to our browser, and what I'm going to do is here, after the domain name /migrate, hit return, and we have some error. App utilities app method must be an instance of controller, instance of migrate controller given. Again, same problem as before. I'd forgotten to extend the controller. There we go, app controllers. Now if we save it, preview in the browser, refresh the page, and if we check our database, refresh, there you go, our table is now created, and as you can see, all of the table columns are also added. We've got everything that we specify, as I said earlier, because we didn't specify the second argument for string. All of these string varchars, basically columns, have length of 255. And so on. Obviously, this increments created the table column with the integer length 10 unsigned, and it's a primary key automatically, which is auto incremented as well, as you can see here. So it's a proper primary key. Okay, so we've got our table. Our migration is done. Obviously, if we wanted to destroy everything, let's create another method, public function down, for instance. The default will be generating the tables, but if we add the second segment to this migrate path called down, that's going to call this method, and I'm going to add doc block here, again, return void, roll back migrations, and I'm going to do the same, inline it, so new migration. And on this migration, I want to run down. So if we now preview it in the browser, and after migrate, just do /down, run it, and now check our database, refresh it, you can see that our table is gone. If you run migrate without the second segment again, that's going to regenerate the table, and there we go, our table is back in our login database.